Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claudia Bornhold. I'm the Dean of the Edwards College of Humanities and Fine Arts here at Coastal Carolina University, and I welcome you to part 2 of what is now becoming a series of panel discussions and Q&As, which I have spontaneously labeled the State of the Union because we did a presentation last week in the aftermath of the January 6th siege attack on the Capitol. And we're coming together again this week with 6 of our faculty colleagues, whom I will introduce in a minute. And the topic today is national security and social media. What I would like to do quickly, if this lets me do this, is share my screen for 1 sec, which is probably the wrong image. Do you see the pictures? Okay, perfect. Just real quick, I grabbed like just four images off the internet and the news media, which I think kind of set the framework a tiny bit for our discussion today. Everyone has seen the first picture with one of the rioters carrying out the podium and waving into the camera, right? So really just photograph me and share my photograph widely, which is what happened. And then the second picture on the top, you see two of the rioters in the Senate, holding their cell phones at each other, just showing like how are our actions being captured here on social media and others. And then the picture on the bottom left, you see that was from 2 days ago from the New York Times. This is armed members of the National Guard camping out in the Capitol building, protecting the members of the House and the Capitol, the Capitol building of the United States. So I find that, I mean, all these images are shocking, but that also I find an incredibly shocking image to see this. And then the last one is just the one image of the suspended accounts, Donald Trump's Twitter account that was suspended, like his Facebook account. You see he had 88 million followers on Twitter. So we all familiar with this. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit. And then the other thing, really recent, I guess, fresh off the press, of course, Horry County, where we are here with Coastal Carolina University, has gotten a lot of media attention since yesterday, when Congressman Tom Rice was one of the 10 Republican members of the House who voted to impeach Donald Trump. So Horry County made it into national media quite a bit since yesterday. So I think it's very timely that we're here today to do this, and I'm really grateful for the 6 faculty members who agreed to join me. And I want to introduce them now real quick. So the first one is Thomas Castillo. He is an assistant professor of history and he comes to Coastal with a PhD in history from the University of Maryland. And his areas of interest are labor history, history of capitalism, social movements, and identity. He just completed a book that will be out later this year on Miami, Florida's working class in the early 20th century. He's also writing a history of the right to work, considering its origins and contested history, including its relationship to the history of equal opportunity. Professor Castillo teaches classes on recent American history, focusing on various periods in the 20th century and on topics such as the American Dream and Reagan's America. So welcome, Professor Castillo, thanks for being here. The second panelist today is Professor Kaitlin Sidorsky. She's an assistant professor of politics. She comes to Coastal with a PhD in political science from Brown University. Professor Sidorsky's research involves the role that gender plays in political ambition, recruitment, and public service. Her book, entitled All Roads Lead to Power, Appointed and Elected Paths to Public Office for U.S. Women, explores the different pathways and ambitions of the men and women who have taken the appointed route to public office in comparison to electoral route. She's currently working on new research that explores the hidden public service of women on state boards and commissions. She researches the intersection of federalism and domestic violence policies at the state and federal level. So we're delighted to have her here. So welcome to be with, thanks for being with us. And then we have Professor Matt Cobb, who is an assistant professor of intelligence and national security studies. He just joined us last fall. And as a new assistant professor, and we're really pleased to have you on this panel and at our university. So welcome. Professor Cobb has a PhD in government and public policy from the University of Arizona. And he completed his PhD with research focusing on the impact of urbanization on patterns of armed conflict in developing countries. He currently teaches in the Intelligence and National Security Studies program at Coastal Carolina. And his research interests include topics such as international security, political violence, and demography. Sorry, and now someone is someone's polishing the floor right outside my door here. So hang on, I let them pass. Prior to his doctoral studies, Professor Cobb worked at the US Department of Commerce. So welcome and thanks for joining us. Our fourth panelist is Anna Maria Langford. Anna Maria is from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and she's an undergraduate student with a major in Intelligence and National Security Studies and minors in Spanish and Criminology. Anna Maria is an executive board member of the Chanticleer Intelligence Brief, where she focuses her studies on the relationship between the White House and the United States intelligence community and how that relationship changes over time. She's finishing her junior year in college this semester, and she plans post-graduation, she plans to launch a career in US intelligence, either civilian or military. We're really, really happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Anna Maria. And then we have Elizabeth Muckensturm. Elizabeth Muckensturm is a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication, Media, and Culture. She comes to us with a master's degree in communication, technology, and society from Clemson University, where she completed a master's thesis focused on the hospitality industry's use of social media. Professor Merkensterm is currently in the process of completing her doctorate in education from North Carolina State, soon a new PhD. And at Coastal, she is teaching courses on public relations and public speaking. This semester, very pertinent, she is teaching a course on social media analytics. She has worked with a variety of social media clients and various social media monitoring and listening platforms. So welcome as well. And then our sixth panelist is Professor Sarah Laiola, who's an assistant professor of English in our program of digital culture and design. Professor Laiola comes with a PhD from the University of California, Riverside. And previous to joining Coastal, she was actually at the Georgia Institute of Technology from 2016 to 2018, where she was a Marion L. Britton postdoctoral fellow. Professor Laiola's teaching and research is in digital poetics and electronic literatures, contemporary digital cultures, including social media and internet culture, critical race and gender studies, particularly how systems of race and gender inequality get reproduced and re-encoded in digital computational systems. Welcome. So that's a wonderful panel, as you can see. I really look forward to our discussion today. And the way we're gonna do this today is each one of the panelists will give a brief just a brief response and analysis of the current events, and then we are moving to a discussion amongst the panelists, and we will also hopefully, get lots of questions from our audience on Facebook that we can answer. So I think we're gonna start with history, with the coming out of the perspective from Professor Castillo to maybe go first and give us his assessment of the events.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage in this conversation with our university and the larger public. I think this is really interesting times, quite surrealistic in many ways. The events of January 6th and the current heightened security concerns make this moment confusing and frightening for many of us. Most of this is unprecedented. And I think this point is a significant one. There are no American antecedents that I can think of that compare to last week or the state of security fears our nation currently faces. It is not hyperbole, I believe, that the media, pundits, and others have referenced 9/11 and the Civil War when trying to make sense of things. Most of us are confused and while also depressed and angry that delusions overtook so many. I would like to begin though with just a quick reminder that this Monday is Martin Luther King Day. And it's good to remember that the longer it's good to remember the longer history of nonviolent protest and the fight for social justice. Martin Luther King's efforts were part of a larger movement that went back in time and was a larger sort of included many people across all kinds, throughout the entire country, women and men of all classes, who struggled for the attainment of civil rights that had long been denied because of white supremacy. But also that he was fighting for economic justice when he, when he was, in the 60s and the 50s. He had always been part of a longer struggle for economic justice. And as many of you know, King was actually assassinated in the midst of a sanitation workers fight for a union. He was helping them organize a union and fight for better wages. These workers were fighting for not only better working conditions, safety protocols, and wages. This was also an effort for a powerful statement about their dignity. So I think we need to remember that too, as far as a point of comparison about the kind of representation of protests that we saw last week, and other kinds of moments in time in a longer history of social movements in this country's history. So where do we begin? There are many starting points. In trying to get to the root of things, I am thinking about this issue of national security and social media as one embedded in debates about truth and knowledge, core themes at the heart of the university and academia. I'm not a philosopher of knowledge, but historians do spend most of their time in engaging sources, verifying their validity, evaluating the logic, and exploring the relationships. We study cause and effect. We work hard to put things into historical context. I think the best way to understand our current historical moment is to understand that it is rooted in three historical dynamics. I'm going to be painting here with a big broad brush because I've got a couple minutes here. The first is that the changes in technology and information. From the various paper publications, newspapers, brochures, books, etc., the telephone, radio, TV, and now the internet, and the varying communication platforms like Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, podcasts, etc., the rate and level of communication traffic and capacity has increased exponentially in the modern world. It is truly mind-boggling. The opportunity and efficiency for information and misinformation to circulate is phenomenal. Even given our mission as a university to teach critical thinking, I think as instructors, we often feel overwhelmed of how to best prepare our students to be sharp, analytical, and self-aware. Anyway, these stories about technology and information and ability to sort of communicate often embed all kinds of stories about individual agency and fight for greater democracy, as well as more negative kind of stories about social control. So that's one dynamic, I think, to understand our current context. The second dynamic has been the history of distrust of government. Sometimes this has also manifested in an ambivalence about democracy. Roots of the recent distrust of government may be found in the politics of the 1960s and after. From the emotion and sense of betrayal about the Vietnam War and subsequent wars, the protests in the streets, Watergate, there developed a sense that government failed in maintaining American greatness in the world, or the promise of achieving the American dream. The rise of a politics that emphasized the failures of government and the need to deregulate helps explain much of the recent period. Stories of political corruption, formal corruption with lobbying and big donors, and the government unfair support of large corporations has often represented other articulations of government failure. So this is another, I think, important dynamic that obviously encompasses a lot. The third dynamic that's related to this one, to the second one, is the history of American exceptionalism and the morality of the market. I think it is not a coincidence that the accusations of socialism and communism that have floated in the air. I believe it is rooted in fears that the opportunity to work toward the American dream is threatened. This is nothing but new, but it often appears strange. It often appears strange, at least to me, given the absence of a left presence in the country. Before you jump on this, think about this for a second, right? We must remember that the histories of like the international workers of the world, who in their preamble said, there's nothing common between the employer and the employee. You're not hearing that kind of rhetoric in mainstream media or almost anywhere in the universe of communication. So they exist in the early 20th century. Let's not forget that Eugene Debs ran 5 times as a socialist candidate for president in the early 20th century, even one time in 1920 from prison. And there are other such historical realities that we simply are missing in our current context. I often ask my students to name one socialist or communist that they know. Some have mentioned Bernie Sanders, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, both who are neither socialist or communist. But the answer is none, nearly 100% of the time. No one knows, they can't, do you know a communist? Do you know a socialist? No one can really identify one. It's missing in our context. I will also point out that one may also find the criticisms of international trade deals, and even the quote unquote Chinese virus as anxieties about protecting the market. And so the market has been put on a pedestal. More critical analysis of political economy is certainly needed in our current context. Unfortunately, this is lacking and almost entirely absent in the discussions of Trumpism and even the current moment. I'll leave it there because I think I've gone a little too much, sorry. So I hope that sort of just frames some of this current context.
Yes, thank you so much. I know there's so much to be said, and we will certainly get back to several of your points. Thank you so much. Then I would ask Professor Sidorsky to go next, please.
Thank you very much. So the frame I think I want to introduce that builds off a lot of what has been said already is the challenges of diversity, right? You know, it's not a coincidence that a lot of these deep-seated feelings that people have of distrust of government and that government's taking over our lives and kind of the rise of Donald Trump coincide with our first African-American president, come back, he wins against the first woman who is the major party candidate, Hillary Clinton, continue on when we have now, who was going to be the first woman in the vice presidency, first woman of color in the vice presidency. None of these things are really, they're not coincidences, right? Racial and gender tensions in this country date back all the way to the very, very beginning, and from colonial times, and even from when Europe, from where people are immigrating from in Asia and Latin America. And I study gender and politics, so I'm very much aware and in tune with seeing how change is happening in this country and people's responses to it. And the fact that there will be the first woman of color, however, right now it's still supposed to happen outdoors, in the normal kind of way, that there will be the first woman of color standing on the steps of the U.S. Capitol building, taking her oath of office, right? Which is an amazing, momentous occasion for a lot of people, and is something to take pride in this country. Upsets people, right? Upsets a certain subset of people a lot in ways that are really hard for other people to understand, like why, why is this the case? And so I think the frame and the lens that I want to kind of think about, the rise of this militant group, extremist group, that yes, it always existed. It's not like these people just popped up out of nowhere, right? They always, kind of existed in the edges of American society. The internet and social media makes it a lot easier for them to come to the forefront and for them to organize, right? In ways that maybe they never had before. But that it's really a response into the changing of American society, right? And I see that change a lot in terms of gender and race and ethnicity, right? And even, sexual orientation, and, everything's just changing, right? And that is hard for a lot of people to accept, right? And this is why they turn around and say, we got to take our country back. Who are you taking it back from? They're Americans, right? They're Americans, or want to be Americans, or want to be a part of American society and contribute to American society, in the same way, right? But because it is this concept of the other, right? It makes it that much harder to find common ground with people. The other thing I want to say is, now that more information is coming out about what actually happened with the events in the Capitol last week, is that it was unfortunately a lot more organized than maybe we all thought it was, right? And that there was some serious breakdowns in security and potentially some serious coordination with people who serve in law enforcement or who are veterans or of that nature, who took part in these riots, right? And there's a very clear line between when something becomes a protest and when then something becomes a riot, and then when something becomes a kind of takeover of government. And when you walk into a building with the intent to either arrest and or harm and or kill public servants, and do so in a coordinated manner, even if it wasn't successful, right, in some ways. That says a lot about the state of this country, and a lot of, unfortunately, healing and educating that needs to happen. So, think about how social media can make us aware, right, that these groups not only exist, but they can coordinate. It gives them an opportunity to coordinate. First off, social media allows us to kind of sort ourselves into groups, and you see who you see, and they typically, in 9 times out of 10, agree with you, and how that just kind of incites more, right? Kind of like that's what the mob mentality is: people getting angry and angrier and angrier because you're feeding each other, you're agreeing with you, right? Everyone's agreeing with you and what you believe in. We self-sort in social media, and social media just makes all these things a lot worse, unfortunately. And so I would kind of push people to think about how the change in America, how how some people take that as a good thing. I obviously, that's exciting, right, to see change and diversity, and other people have a really hard time with that, and how social media only exasperates those feelings, right? Because it really can, and it really does, and obviously some very deadly ways. And so I'm curious to see what my fellow panelists have to say about their thoughts on what happened last week. But I would think about change and diversity and how this kind of fits into this narrative.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I think you gave a good segue to our 2 panelists coming from the Intelligence and National Security program here. And you talked about the organized, the organized riot and what we call it, riot, protest, coup, right? So I'm going to ask Professor Cobb to go next, and then right after him, Anna Maria can go next. So.
Sure. Well, I'd like to start by thanking you for putting together this panel and for the opportunity to speak here. But I'll start by saying that it's very clear at this point that the events of last week were influenced very significantly by things that were being said on social media. And as we look forward to the inauguration that's coming next week, there are a lot of concerns about whether those same social media forces could create a risk of violence for the upcoming inauguration. And if I'm sure that many of the people watching this might have seen the news, but the FBI has recently provided briefings to top US officials, including the president-elect, that there's a lot of chatter, they call it, on social media discussing the possible presence of armed protesters at the coming inauguration event, something which of course is very concerning due to the possibility it could lead to violence. But it's also important to remember that in a lot of ways, the use of social media for those purposes, for coordinating violence, is something that can really be a double-edged sword. Because in the same way that a person with radical ideas or violent intent can get a lot of like-minded people together to cause trouble, it's also something that can be a very valuable tool for law enforcement in producing intelligence assessments that could be used to improve security practices in the future. Certainly, the FBI is very carefully monitoring the online chatter and looking for information that can be used to support the security operations at the upcoming inauguration. And it's also the case that it can be used as an investigative tool to identify people who have committed violence. After all, many of the protesters who breached the Capitol and were causing damage took selfies, put them online, and plenty of arrests are now happening. So that's something that we should consider, that in the same way that people who cause trouble can use the social media, so can the authorities. But this is not a new discussion per se. The interest in the role of social media in coordinating politically significant action, and in some cases very violent action, is something that really became popular both in the area of conflict research as well as in policy circles after the Arab Spring protest movements more than a decade ago, where there were a very large number of mass scale protests organized in a very short amount of time that in some cases took down governments. And this is something that is very interesting, because there are people who debate about how exactly we can measure the effect of social media on some of these protest events, or in some cases violent and potentially revolutionary events. Because after all, the chatter that goes on in social media occurs at the same time that we have important, or in some cases inflammatory, discussions going on in traditional media, whether it's the newspaper, the TV, the radio, and also through word of mouth, which is very important because a lot of the people who join in and actively participate in protest or violent activities do so when they have friends who are doing it. After all, you know, if you personally know people who are doing something, your chances of joining in are much more likely. But even with these other influences of traditional media and word of mouth, the social media is found in a lot of research to have an amplifying effect on violence. For example, there have been some very interesting studies done on riots in Europe, hate crimes as well, showing that activities on social media have caused spikes in various levels of participation or intensity of some of these types of activities. And when we look at higher levels of conflict, for example, armed conflict, civil wars in Africa, there have been some very interesting studies showing that the presence of social media or the use of social media can accelerate the spread of violence across large areas. So it's something that's very, very interesting. I'm not saying that this is what we saw here last week was a civil war, but it's just, I'm bringing this up to illustrate the importance of social media in amplifying some of these things that we see. And the other thing that I just wanted to remind us all of is that a lot of these acts of political violence, they tend to occur in clusters in time. So, you know, if there's been a very recent event, the chance of something further happening in the near future is quite high, and it tends to decline over time. But for the near future, there is an elevated risk that further armed protests could happen, just, you know, based on the fact that there are so many fresh wounds and increased passions that we've seen from a lot of the discussions. And social media is something that can inflame those, but after all, we should keep in mind it's also a tool for communication. It's not necessarily the root cause of a lot of these problems. So the grievances people have, the things that make them angry, that make them willing to participate in riots or other forms of violence, those things are, you know, they exist in social media, but they exist in the real world too. And so in order to decrease the risk that there's going to be further violence, there's a lot of stuff that has to be done, both in the social media world and in the wider society. But anyway, I'll turn it over to my fellow table discussants here.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Cobb, and thank you for having me here with you guys. I want to just talk about looking at this from an intelligence perspective, because it's very interesting. As Professor Castillo mentioned earlier, for a lot of people, and this is true for many Americans, this is very much an unprecedented time, and not a lot of people expected something like this. But those of us who study intelligence and those who work in intelligence are learning over the past week that maybe that's not the case. We've seen reports over the last week from both the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI stating that there might have been intelligence that have pointed towards violence during that Capitol building or that Capitol session. And it's just something that maybe wasn't as unexpected as we had thought. So the question is how do we take this scenario that we just went through and work toward and make it a safer situation for us to have the inauguration and not make the same intelligence communications mistake we've made in this situation. So there's all sorts of security measures being taken place in both the physical world and the cyber world, being the social media aspect of it. As Dr. Cobb mentioned earlier, the FBI is continually monitoring chatter on all social media sites in all 50 states. And there's been a lot of security measures going into place for a safe inauguration. And that's something really interesting because traditionally an incoming president and an outgoing president in the United States has been a time of celebration in this country. But it's a little bit different this time with all the hostility and different situations going on.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm watching parallel at the Facebook stream, so where we have a little delay. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for that. So we're gonna, I mean, you just mentioned the inauguration. Of course, we have also this very unusual situation that the outgoing president is not attending the inauguration, right? So I think that's remarkable as well. All right, perfect. I'm gonna ask Professor Merkensterm to go next.
Yeah, I agree, and I echo everyone's comments thus far. We really are in an interesting time politically, health-wise, mentally, and nothing like anyone has ever experienced before, and hopefully in the years to come won't experience again. While we're all at home, we've really relied on social media and the media in general, probably more so than we normally do, to communicate with our friends, to communicate with each other, to know what's going on in the absence of gathering in big groups, gathering in even small groups. And the word of mouth has really kind of changed, although social media has always been a form of word of mouth. It's really allowed for a different type of discourse to happen, I would say, in the last few years. So where it has been very useful, like some of you have already mentioned, in Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, Arab Springs, and it's been really beneficial for positive social movement. I think we're starting to also see the role that social media can play in negative social movements or in violence. And it will be interesting when we look at this moment in time and this moment in history in the future to see how much that has actually already been maybe boiling under the surface, that these groups have already been using social media to coordinate. And some of this we can track. We can look at the hashtags, we can, follow the chitter chatter that's on social media, but some of it we can't track. Some of it with private messaging and the ways that we can communicate on social media that we can't publicly see or not publicly facing are kind of concerning. And like I said, they can be used for good. It can be used for good communication, but it can also not. And so I think it'll be interesting when we look back to see maybe how some of these social media platforms can be held responsible, or if and how they should be held responsible. So I know many of you have probably been following along with things on social media. Is it okay for Twitter to ban President Trump? And what kind of rights and legal issues surround that? And I don't know if I have a real solid opinion on that yet. And I think we will start to see other companies, we have seen other companies follow suit. And it's been interesting to see once Twitter kind of said, you know what, we are going to ban President Trump. It was interesting to see how many other companies followed quickly behind that. And not just social media companies, shopping companies, industry, commerce that followed suit immediately after that. So it was a moment in time where one social media company said something was good or bad, and then others felt like they could do the same thing, which it could be good, or bad going forward. But I think a lot of the social media companies are also maybe acknowledging a little bit of their responsibility that they have, or that they should have. Maybe some of them will feel, I don't know if I want to say guilt, but feel the strength of the role that they played in the Capitol riots and any other violent behavior. So I think it'll be interesting to see how social media platforms really respond in stopping or taking responsibility for any of those. And of course, we have seen some of the social media companies stocks slightly go down, and I think that will flatten out, and it won't leave a lasting impression on some of the social media companies. But something else I want to talk about really quickly, and this might come up in some of the questions as well, is social media's role in the election. So researchers, and there's a lot of good researchers at Clemson University right here in our state and at Coastal, I'm sure, that have researched the social media's role in both this election and the 2016 election. And so far it looks like there's been less interference in foreign trolls than we have seen in the prior election. So I'm going to share, I don't know if I can share in the chat, but maybe we can share this. Clemson University created this quiz, and let me just say it orally so you all can look at it. It's called spotthetroll.org. And I encourage everyone to look at that quiz, read through it, take the quiz. I will say, as somebody that has studied social media and follows social media listening and monitoring, I was actually stumped on some of these profiles on the quiz. So the quiz will lead you through some profiles of Russian trolls, and you have to identify if they are a real person or if they are indeed a troll. And I will say, as a person that studies this field, I was wrong on some of them. And it's scary to see just the manipulation that foreign and domestic trolls can influence us in sharing memes and sharing false information or disinformation, positive information, any information, really, because not all trolls share false information. They want to engage you in a way that makes you think that they are real. So I would encourage you to look at spotthetroll.org, and really know and question who's creating the memes that you might be sharing, who's creating the information that you're viewing, who is actually behind some of the divisive rhetoric that occurs on social media. And I think we'll start to see more of that come to the public view. As we know, social media listening and monitoring tools have a huge ability, or a great ability, to track legally what people are doing. And I think people will start to learn more about that. And the last thing I will say, going back to the pictures we saw at the very front of this panel, it is crazy how many people that was an acceptable behavior to take pictures of really illegal activity like they weren't doing anything illegal. And of course, this is not the first time that we've seen this. You know, we see people commit crimes and post it on social media, even if it's a petty crime. And what I fear is that a lot of people don't realize that by doing that to maybe be cool, they don't realize that it sends the message to some people that this action is okay. And I think that will be interesting to see how social media is held responsible for the spreading of those kind of glorification or entertainment of not acceptable or illegal behavior. So that's all I'll say for now. I'm sure I'll be able to answer, any questions you have coming up.
Great. Thank you so much. I already have like 18 questions written down, but we want to, of course, first hear Professor Laiola as well, because I know she has a lot to add to this. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dean Bornhold. I do want to check, is my mic working okay? I switched tech once we were on. Okay, good. Having the same problem of background noise. So first, let me just echo all of my panelists and thanking you, Dean Bornhold, for gathering us together here and giving us this opportunity to speak on this panel. And also on a wider note, in making these panels a small series. I know that I actually found a lot of clarity and peace from last week's panel. So I hope that this one and all the ones going forward can help kind of provide that for viewers as we're kind of figuring out, like what is tomorrow going to bring in the long 2020, right? So in any case, though, I work from a literature perspective on digital literatures and storytelling in digital media, which doesn't perhaps immediately seem relevant to this particular topic, but where I'd like to kind of think about is, and that I haven't quite seen named, is the stories that we tell ourselves about social media and the social web, which is related to this. So, and for that, by that I mean things like, how do we understand the information that we access on the web? How do we understand how that information comes to us? How do we understand who we are when we're on the web? Or even just to reference Elizabeth's Spot the Troll quiz, which is a fantastic quiz, and I will +1 recommend that. Just even how do we understand the terminology of the web? Because what I was struck by taking that quiz is that I have always used the term troll to actually refer to a human bad actor, right? Not a program or a bot, as in this quiz, right? And the question of spot the non-human versus spot the human that's a bad actor is actually a very different question, right? And just that small difference in terminology, I think, tells us a lot about the ways that we do not consistently understand and have a consistent cultural narrative of how social media and social media information comes to us. And I think that is also related to some of the references that my panelists have made and that folks all over the web have been making since last week, of like these guys going into the Capitol building and taking selfies and live streaming as if that's a normal thing to do, where you're almost like, don't you guys know how to criminal write? Like, come on, like you don't graffiti your name and address so you don't get arrested later, right? Like, why are you giving this information over? And this isn't to be like these were stupid people going in. It's to say like, this is consistent with a cultural narrative that we tell about how social media works and who we are on social media and who we're actually broadcasting to. And an important part of that is that this is a story that is supported by social media platforms and those companies to keep us on these platforms, right? To keep everything, amongst friends, or just you and your handful of followers, or you and your influencers. And it's something that if we kind of look through our different evolution of platforms, we see it being talked about in popular discourse most consistently with TikTok, because no one knows how TikTok decides what shows up on your page, right? And that's like the mystery of TikTok. Of course, someone knows, but generally speaking, right, no one knows. So I think one thing that's been missing here is like a real kind of deeper dive into what we could broadly call critical tech literacy or critical digital literacy. And I know there's been criticisms of returning to literacy all the time, because certainly we are working with smart actors and with very digitally literate people. But on a kind of wider cultural level, I think we need to note that there actually is a really weakening literacy, or a literacy that is not persistent, in the sense that we may know when we go to Google, for instance, that it is there is search engine optimization that will affect what shows up in your search results. You can pay, because they're an advertising company, you can pay to get to the top of a list, right? And so, and like we may know that, right? And we know that Google will produce like so many pages of information. And we know that we're maybe being weak researchers by only looking at the first page, right? Like even if we have this awareness, it does not persist beyond like a blip, and then you kind of go. It's kind of like a EULA, right? That when we check the terms of service, we're like, yep, I did that, moving on. Where it's just this kind of practice that we jump in, we use Google, we trust what it produces for us, even though we also know all these other complexities behind it. So I think there's a kind of lost persistent literacy that we don't hold on to when we use social media platforms. And I know I've just used Google, which we don't tend to think of as social media, but really the web right now is the social web, right? And with Google being part of that infrastructure. So that's one thing that I think is worth discussing further. And then the other thing that I think is worth discussing is the way that the social web is set up to benefit extremist viewpoints. And when I say extremist, I mean like in the sense of hyperbole, as we would discuss in a literature class, where it loses nuance, we lose context, and it's about those clickbait headlines. It's about who can get the quickest info and the loudest reactions quickest, as opposed to who can just sit down and have like a chill conversation amongst people, right? That it really doesn't benefit moving information that is contextually nuanced and that accounts for all different sides and all different pieces. It's really set up to benefit information that is like quick, viral, extreme, and quickly digestive. And I'm going to stop with that because I'm sure there are questions and comments coming in. Again, thanks so much for having us here, and I look forward to the conversation we're about to have.
Great. Well, thank you, all 6 of you. Wonderful. I'm going to start because we got a couple of questions. I'm going to start with these. The first one is for Dr. Sidorsky. And it's a question: could you share your insights on how the rhetoric of the 2016 campaign laid the foundations for the violence we saw last week?
I think that's a great question. I actually would, I think I'd want to go back to the rhetoric of President Obama, right? I mean, I think, you know, birtherism, taking back our country was, you know, questions of whether he was a Muslim or not. I think all of this kind of sets the rhetoric for what then ends up coming through in 2016, right? I definitely feel like Trump's rise to power, his candidacy in 2016, is a direct reaction, right, to the election of the first African-American president, and twice. And then that he is then against, you know, running against other, right? You know, so even though Hillary Clinton is an example of the establishment, right? The Clintons obviously have been around for a very long time. She's a former first lady, former senator. I get that, but she's also a woman, right? And so, you don't see as many women as men in political spaces in American government at all levels. And so, you know, she was another representation, just in a different form, of the other. And, you know, in a lot of ways, I think when you go down a certain pathway and you start to talk about things at their most simplistic, basic, and nastiest level, it's hard to go back, right? You know, when someone moves that line and goes, well, you know, I can say this about women, right? Or I could say this about, you know, African Americans, and there's no real backlash to it. I mean, no real consequence to it, right? You know, so you think about, like, you know, the Access Hollywood tape, right, for example, you know, of what he was caught saying, and there really was no consequence in the end to him. I feel consequence to society, yes, but to him there really wasn't necessarily a consequence, because he still won the election, you know, electoral college a few weeks later. You know, so I think that the rhetoric definitely started, you know, definitely 2016 is a direct connection. I think 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, you know, with starts, you know, the questioning of, you know, who should serve and their background, and whether or not that background was legitimate enough just based upon their race and their name, sets up a lot of, you know, this thinking and this being able to band together and question, right? And if, you know, it's so interesting because, you know, sometimes you go down the rabbit hole, right, and you start to see what other people are putting and what they're thinking, and, you know, just to like try and make sense of what, you know, people are saying about these people who are running for office and then going to serve. And although it's not because of her, you know, they tried for Kamala, right, Harris, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, to like question her, you know, was she was eligible to be vice president, right? They tried birtherism on her, right, even in those circles, and it didn't stick quite as much as it did for Obama. But I think all of that it's all very much tied together. I really do. It definitely sets up the tone of what is acceptable, how low people will go to question people's legitimacy. You know, sometimes I just sit and go, when did we move as a society from saying like, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and if you're not that, you're bad, right? You know, you're automatically the enemy, right? What happened there? Because it used to be that, yeah, you didn't agree, right? You didn't have to agree, but you didn't have to come to the same policy solutions, but you didn't think that they were like, you know, the enemy of America and going to take America's soul. But now a lot of people do, right? And that's sad, right? As a political scientist, that's sad, right? You know, and as an American, that's sad, and it's sad to see that, and that's hard to undo. It's a lot of years now of this kind of rhetoric. So I think it's an excellent question. I think a lot of it kind of stems from 2016, but like a lot of it is rooted in the election of the first African American president. I do.
Great, thank you so much. Just if any of the other panelists wants to add on, please do.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
Right, so this certainly is a longer history of racism and sexism. And sort of the story of race baiting has been part of the political landscape for a long time, right? We know that, that was used as a way to sort of exclude and to rile up the public. That was part of the political dynamics since the late 19th century and continued to the 20th century. And I think that I would add to Kaitlin's comments too, that also our current context is sort of the phenomenon of reality TV. I mean, we're living the last three decades where, I mean, I think it's not surprising that Trump winning in 2016 is basically, a person who participated in professional wrestling and was, had the Apprentice show. These are things that are part of this that we can't forget, that it's part of this connection that people have with these celebrities. And so, I think that's a part here too. So race baiting, the history of sexism, these are long stories in this country's history, but that's embedded in this kind of narrative of this sort of expectation about what we want from a leader or want from a political character, that this sort of embodiment of some of the characteristics of our larger culture. So I think that's an aspect there. So reality TV, I think, is partly to explain this kind of culture dynamic too, about being open about one's views and so forth.
Great.
And I would just kind of add to this and point out again that in addition to being the nation's first Black president, President Obama is also the first president where we really see the role that social media can play in placing somebody into a position of power and into the presidency, right? And in that moment, right, like he catered the youth vote by being like the cool president, right? Who can have a selfie stick and who can like be on Facebook and live stream into all these different spaces in a way that, and I'm not a media scholar, but I would imagine that like this is not unlike FDR showing up in your living room on the radio, right? This kind of like, wow, look at this cool cutting edge thing that's happening here. And then what we kind of see shift 8 years later with President Trump is we see a shift to recognizing the ways that algorithms and social media can be used in a kind of reality TV model to take away nuance, to take away context, and simply run with like what keeps me at the top of every algorithmic return regardless, right? And of course, because so many things are based on these popularity algorithms, staying at the top is keeping people engaged, even if it's negative engagement. So we kind of very literally encode this, I'm blanking on words here, but this idea that like bad press is good press because any press is good press because that is what keeps you at the top of the Google search or keeps you trending on Twitter or keeps you whatever. And that's not nothing, right? Regardless of, it was very easy to kind of say like, oh, it's just rhetoric or look, it's such inflammatory rhetoric and so on. And it absolutely, he's always been an inflammatory rhetorician, but that works in the information environment that he and we are working in, which is the social web.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. I think social media allows us to share and legitimize some of the comments that our presidents or politicians make that before the age of social media may have been said aloud at a press conference or at a public event, but not necessarily shared, retweeted, memed in the way that social media allows. So really before President Obama's presidency, we really didn't use social media in the way that we use it now for sharing both good and bad information, which I think allows even the tiniest little soundbite, whether it be something that was said positively or something that could be used against that politician or president, it's easier to share. It's easier for that to gain momentum to then, like you said, populate to the top of the algorithms. Like, hey, people are engaging in this. People like whatever positive or negative thing that was said. It's getting interactions. And it makes it way easier for us to spread anything, really, but especially some of those tidbits that before social media may have been said and kind of overlooked or not really made into a big deal. And that could be, again, a good thing for social media, but I think we've seen in this last presidency that it's not been used the most effectively.
Great. Thank you. I want to shift a little bit the topic over to the intelligence side. I have a question here for Anna Maria Langford that comes from Professor Fitzanakis, who says, have the recent resignations and constant firings of senior intelligence officers affected the ability of the intelligence and security communities to protect the nation during this transition, or does it matter at all?
Yeah, so just a little bit of reference for what Dr. Fitzanakis is referring to. In the days after the election, President Trump made the decision to first fire his Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. And then just a few days ago, the acting Department of Homeland Security Secretary announced his resignation amongst the events going on. So as far as what role that plays into how the intelligence agencies are able to properly protect the nation in these times, the biggest issue here and that I've determined is the inconsistency within these agencies once you start removing the heads of these agencies. So now, as to where the Department of Homeland Security were abiding and following under the guidance of the former acting secretary, they now, amidst the crisis, have to collaborate and coordinate with a new leader. So I could see the biggest issue being some inconsistencies.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The other question, kind of intelligence related question that I wrote down is this foreign influence on all of what we're seeing right now. Is there any evidence on, we talked a little bit on the foreign influence on the election outcome, of course, that's come up quite a bit, but is there any information we can discuss potentially about foreign influence on what happened last week, right? And also the security threats for the inauguration.
Well, to be honest, am not sure the exact level of foreign influence on the events that we saw last week or presently in the run-up to the upcoming inauguration. What I have been very aware of, though, are discussions of what happened at the Capitol building last week that are taking place overseas. So this has been something that has been tremendous success. And in fact, actually, I believe Vladimir Putin was doing a televised interview in which he referred to the Capitol building riot as an excellent event. He used that term. This is something that I wouldn't say that this is necessarily something that has been plotted by Russian trolls. There are quite a few people within the domestic sphere who have very strong opinions about some things. And of course, I say this without the full investigation into what happened. So it's quite possible that maybe we will find something. But regardless, in a lot of non-democratic societies, the riots actually are seen as a very good thing, because you can then have a president like Vladimir Putin say to his people, well, things in America are terrible. You don't want anything like that. You're better off with my style of governance than having some kind of American democracy, which is not, in his opinion, even remotely desirable. So anyway, this I think has been a real media coup for a lot of countries, and the Chinese media has also taken this and run with it, and the same with Iran. So you have a lot of traditional rivals, or I guess you could say even potential enemies of the U.S. who have really gotten as much as they could out of the public relations side of this.
If I could add on to what Dr. Cobb was saying, I feel like if we focus on the potential for foreign influence, we're kind of we're not paying attention to the issue at hand that the Department of Homeland Security called months ago, these extremist groups being the most persistent and lethal threat to the United States during this election season. And the FBI has also just released a report about these internal extremist groups being heightened due to the election tensions. So I don't know if that's something we necessarily need to focus on right now, just because the internal issues at hand are so heightened and tense. Great.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think that is also what makes the situation, of course, so remarkable, right? Because other attacks, at least the majority of attacks on American security, you know, usually we look outside, right? And it's all an ingrown phenomenon we're looking at right now. So I want to go back to a question from the Facebook that says, is there any research that shows disrupting someone's social media echo chamber is productive in changing that person's mind? And there is a kind of connected question here as well from Professor Holliday, who said, he writes, I helped conduct a study several years ago that found people online tend to not only not see opposing opinions different from their own, but also that moderators on some social media tend to intentionally block those other points of view. Now, algorithms do the same. Do you all have any advice for A, how to avoid echo chambers, or B, how to communicate with people who are in those echo chambers? Whoever wants to volunteer. I don't have advice.
That's a tough question. I think that it's the same kind of question that we deal with in general, as far as how do we make a critical citizenry? You know, how do we get people to think broadly and analytically about content in general? So it's not just something that would be limited just to the social media platform. But I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, as a historian, I see often too often perhaps continuities. So, like, you know, there's been criticism of the media for centuries, you know, in regards to what is excluded, you know, and so you think of the early 20th century, and you know, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called Brass Check right around the First World War, and he made the book. He didn't copyright the book so he can have wider circulation, because he wanted people to get the news about how the media was really biased, and it was it was excluding certain things and highlighting certain things. So same kinds of dynamic of trying to highlight certain things and objectify certain groups and marginalize and exclude certain groups was a dynamic within the way knowledge was being created and circulated. So if you were picking up a newspaper, I would want to, like, just, I guess, make you hesitate to think like there was a period before of nostalgia, like, oh, back then you only had a newspaper, you picked it up and it was objective. No, objectivity was problematic back then as well. It had other kinds of dynamics, and some that reflect what we are seeing today. So I think that to answer the question, essentially, that, yeah, I mean, I think reading broadly, reading deeply, being engaged, asking questions are things that are vital in whatever context. I'm not sure if there's any sort of basic advice one can give other than that, which is, you know, to read deeply. I remember when I first started reading The Nation magazine back in the late 1990s. The Nation magazine, it's a left magazine. I was shocked, like, what the hell is this? I was like, wait a second, I have never seen this anywhere. And it was both liberating and exciting, and just to sort of see engaged journalism, framing of history and contextual analysis of history, and so it was something that I had never seen. It was 1997, that I first started looking at that, and so I wondered, to what extent do people get a chance to really read good journalism, right? Good analytical work. I think one of the problems of the internet and online stuff is that you get a lot of shabby work, right? There isn't the same kind of process of like peer review and really strong sort of standards of academic work, So I think that's one of the problems. So you get this very tainted kind of work, and I think it's a problem that's probably much more exponential because of its breadth and depth. But yeah.
And then I'll just kind of add to that and return a bit to the question, both of changing someone's mind out of a filter bubble, and then to Dr. Holliday's original point of that there's many people that get into filter bubbles and don't even see opposing views. And that is one thing that in my field, I've seen a number of reports of that now, that part of what is so compelling for believing that Vice President-elect Biden is not truly elected, right, and was fraudulently elected, is that nobody knows anyone who voted for him, right? Like no one on anybody's entire Facebook experience voted for him, or like vice versa, and I'm sure that the opposite is true, that there's been lots of analyses of political predictions of 2016 of like, how did no one see Trump coming, right? That he just kind of kept getting further along in the process, when all the polls were like, no, this isn't going to happen. So it's like, how did we predict that so poorly? And so no doubt there was a similar experience then of, people waking up and being like, how did this guy just win when I don't know anybody who voted for him? And certainly pre-social media scale, that still existed because, it was like your street or your neighbors or your colleagues. And now that's at scale, that is still actually quite small. I think we all have had the experience of looking at Facebook and being like, why do I just see the same thing from these 10 people? Like my friend from grad school who I talked to one time, that one guy from high school that's still hanging around for some reason, or like whatever. That we've all had this experience of knowing that it's the same people in this kind of like wash, rinse, repeat cycle, but it feels like it's at a much wider scale of people that we're getting access to. So I think that that's an important thing to consider here. But to the question of changing minds, and I will preface this with, I'm not in that field of how do we make people think what we want them to think. But some research that I have seen suggests that one of the best ways to do it is to disrupt the filter bubble as best you can, and to replace the narrative with another narrative. That it's much easier to believe, like, no, President Obama wasn't born in Kenya, he was specifically born in Hawaii, than it is to believe, no, he wasn't born in Kenya, full stop, right? So that it's not sufficient to simply stop a narrative, it needs to be added, another narrative needs to take its place. And that's stuff that I've just kind of seen casually in pop media. That's not my expertise at all. But in terms of advice, and this is what I tend to tell my students who are concerned about their filter bubbles and want to create a better experience online, I think part of it is trying to keep your critical awareness persistent and remember that you're not ever getting a full picture, even if it looks that way. And then to follow, make a point of following and engaging with people with conflicting viewpoints. And I say that with some asterisks because at this point that can be so extremist, and I do think this happens on both sides, that you can see a meme that is simply enticing some kind of violence or just flat out not true or offensive in various ways, and it's like, who wants that to be their social media experience when many of us still go to social media to socialize, right, and to turn off a bit, not to like, we don't watch the news for that, we go to social media for that, right? So I think that's part of it, is making a point to keep people on your Twitter feed that you don't agree with. Follow people, don't, mute that person on Facebook that keeps posting, the memes that you disagree with, or the stories from, the whatever side leaning content that you disagree with, but to keep those people around, because that is really the best way to quote unquote game the algorithm, because we have to remember that we're not simply playing with our choices, we are playing with and we're working with what is offered to us to choose from, right? And so it's like, if you want chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, but you never know that strawberry exists, then like you can never choose strawberry, right, to put it in ice cream terms, because why not? So I think it's important to remember that that's the case, that there are just simply versions of events that you do not get access to. And that's what really blocks us. And that's the challenging part of existing in a social media information infrastructure, such as we currently do.
I'll add to that as well. And I'm not just saying this because I'm in the communication department. I also think teaching media literacy at an early age and throughout life, even after someone has graduated college, or even if they haven't, I think teaching and media literacy and making people aware of media literacy that maybe are not in college or have graduated is really important. Knowing how to decipher what is credible, what's not credible, how to look for sources, and not just with politics, but every industry, any industry that anyone is in, seeking credible sources, learning how to navigate the internet and understand basic media literacy concepts, I think, are so important, and really important at every age. I mean, starting in K through 12 systems. And of course, this is not just a plug for our department, but also, in our department, the courses that we teach, teaching students to be media literate, I think, is a really important step and understanding different voices that are out there that may be different than yours, that you're not just following your friends' opinions on social media, that you're not taking some of those things as facts if they are not indeed true facts, which I think is what social media allows to happen so easily, that you can follow things that your friends or maybe even just acquaintances, people that you follow, that spread disinformation in things that are not true, but they come from maybe somebody you think would share credible information. So I think basic media literacy is really important for everyone.
I can interject one point really quick. I hope I don't want to take too much time, but I think one thing we want to remember too is that we're talking about this at a cerebral level. I think we also need to remember that there's a pleasure principle here about, and the affective aspect about engaging in social media and all these kind of things. I think it's not, if you look at the Capitol event, right? What a lot of it was going on there was almost like some kind of carnival. People were climbing up walls. So like there was one section where you can climb walls. You can take all these, these pictures where people are taking, they communicate with each other. I think there's an affective part about what's happening that is not in any way about media literacy, right? It's about connecting with a community. And that's why I think they're kind of closed off. And I think it's also just about pleasure. And it's about reaffirming one's identity in these kinds of locations. So I think but to add a complexity to this is that it's not just about using the right tools to be literate, because I think sometimes when I've talked to my family, who sometimes are a little bit more conservative, for example, I'm like, why are they approaching? I'm like Spock, and I'm trying to talk to them with logic, and it's like it's in the gut, it's in the emotion, and I'm not sure how we engage that. That's the tougher. I think it's a tough part, So.
Well, thank you. I want to read a comment we got from Michael Roos, who is a professor in our philosophy department here, who says, I think what we can talk about as important is what is the human becoming by living in a computer mediated communication social world? What does it mean to trust a virtual algorithm to determine who hears what we are saying? So not surprisingly, a question coming from a philosophy professor here. That is a really good question. I think it links well, and comment that links well with what you've just been talking about as well. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on it. Otherwise, I move on to the next. Just want to say thanks. Sarah, go ahead.
The only thing I want to comment to this is not, and I don't have an answer. I think it means whatever the millennial experience is, and then going forward. But I do want to just kind of flag this assumption in the second half of the question of what does it mean to trust a virtual algorithm to determine who hears what we are saying? Because there's actually a lot of really important work coming out of the field of content moderation that is highlighting that, in fact, I think that there's a weird version of comfort that comes from thinking that it's simply a machine that's feeding us up crap, right? And that if it's not people, it's just a machine and it's a bug in the machine and we can figure out that and whatever. And that's not happening, right? Certainly the algorithmic infrastructure behind social media is a very important aspect of this. But I think that we would be remiss to think that it is entirely machines and forget that there's also multiple points of which they are human interveners. One being, of course, the humans that develop those machines and the humans that write those algorithms. They don't just grow on the algorithm tree. Someone has to sit down and decide what logical steps follow out and what leads to what and what connects to what. Like someone has to do that in the first place for the algorithm to process. And then that when we're thinking, I saw content moderation in here a few times, but when we're thinking about content moderation, not as taking content away, but as determining what shows up, that is very much a role of a human job still, right? That AI can only do so much, and that some of the harder stuff to do is done by human actors who actually work in incredibly poor working conditions. There's been a few exposés come out, there's been a few documentaries, some academic books. Sarah T. Roberts is a leading researcher in this particular field that talks about the specific labor conditions of human content moderators at scale, the ones who determine, this naked picture is art and this one is pornography, or this picture is propaganda and this one is important news that needs to go out. Those kind of finer tuned questions that we are right to not judge, to hand over to a machine to judge, but also that our AI simply isn't there to judge.
Fabulous, thank you. I have another question that somewhat relates. It's coming from Ryan Zindel, who's a student at Coastal. Welcome, Ryan. Thanks for joining us. And he asked for any panelist, will the implementation of censorship, banishment, and silencing of individuals on social media lead to more violence in relation to national security? Any thoughts on how to circumvent such consequences, either on the platform level or regulations issued by Congress? So that's a great question, and obviously also refers to the suspension of President Trump's social media accounts. I don't know who wants to go.
Well, I'll say one thing. Watching Fox News the last few days, that's the narrative right now. They're trying to spark a sort of anger about these kind of restrictions, and it's surreal when you watch it, because they're not talking about what happened last week, or they're talking about how Trump's Twitter account was closed. And so there's this weird dynamic of there's this anti kind of corporate monopoly of Twitter and Google, and they want some freedom of speech, but never any commentary about the content of what Trump has been saying for 4 years on Twitter, and all the misinformation and the documented evidence of the misinformation. Just that fact that his right was taken from him. So I think, I'm not quite sure, because I think they're helping to sort of stir this. And this stuff is not just happening on Fox, but it's happening on the other sources of media. I'm not watching Newsmax or these other news platforms, but I think that they're stirring this kind of narrative. So I think that there's a sort of interplay between what's being echoed in the social media frameworks and communication networks with what's happening in the media, and they're being fed these kinds of narratives that are just going to get reproduced and repeated in these areas. So so I think on that level, it will cause some anger. I hope it doesn't lead to violence, but I think it does. It is stirring people.
If I could just add on this from like a factual standpoint, whenever you sign up for any social media account, and that includes all of us on this panel and President Trump himself, you agree to a set of terms and conditions. And once those are violated, or once something, if you're being prosecuted or something like that, then you are subjectable to have your account suspended regardless of who you are. So it is important for us to monitor what we put on the internet.
I think it's also important to remember that, and it's so hard because I think for a lot of us, we grew up with it. There was a world without social media and the internet, right? I mean, he has a press office in his building. He has a press team. There's the radio. He can call in. He can go on the TV. There's so many opportunities to still reach the American public that don't include social media. Does that not mean that is not a huge blow to someone who, relies on social media and it's a way to access people? Of course it is. It does hurt, right? A politician to not have access to social media. But I also want to remind everyone that he does still have a lot of power with the media, right? I mean, they still report on him. He puts out a video and it's on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Everyone is showing it or reporting on it. ABC, NBC, right? These are all really important ways in which we still communicate. Social media is not the only way in which we communicate. It's not the only way he can communicate, and he hasn't, right? He put a video up on YouTube, right? A couple, yesterday or the day before, right? About, the response to the violence, right? So I think that's also, we put so much stock in social media and it is so powerful, but I also don't want to shortchange the other very powerful ways we all communicate, and especially leaders can communicate, that are still really, really important, and are really effective ways in which to communicate with the public. I think that's really important to remember.
Good point. I would also just say that it was interesting because recently the big TV broadcast channel like CNN started to censor Trump. Like it was, he's giving false information. They cut off from him. And I thought it was an amazing, powerful kind of like a moment. Like I didn't see that before. Like where did that happen when he was lying before? They gave him all this broadcast time. We know like in 2015, 2016, when he was running, he had so much free media, which allowed him to, it helped facilitate his campaign. So when they started recently to sort of cut him off when he was lying, I thought, well, that's interesting. It's just to highlight Kaitlin's point about the power of that media platform.
I would like
Yeah,
to add something to that. One of the things that I think is very interesting, and just because I've watched some of the critical discussions they've had about, you know, the term, I guess, is censorship or content moderation that's been going around on Fox News, are a lot of these complaints about Parler, the, you know, far right sort of, or I say far right, I'm sure there are people who describe it in other ways, but you know, an app that's specifically made for people with certain sets of opinions and who would like to discuss them without having a content moderator from Facebook, Twitter, or wherever. But Parler was delisted from the Apple iTunes store and from the or from the App Store of Apple and Google and Amazon. And one of the things that it did occur to me is, you know, there is quite a bit of demand for some of these platforms for discussion, and limiting them on certain channels is not necessarily going to eliminate them, but rather drive people with demand for those sorts of, or access to those sorts of things, to other places. And this is one of the things that we saw when, for example, law enforcement agencies began monitoring 4chan, for example, which right-wing groups were using to discuss all kinds of things involving hate speech. There then was the creation of 8chan. A lot of people moved to another platform online to discuss a lot of things that, you know, could rightly be criticized as, you know, white supremacist kind of language or various types of hate speech. So I think that using that as an example, I think it is pretty clear that moderating content or eliminating the ability of people to access apps through certain ways isn't going to eliminate the opinions that people are interested in discussing on those platforms. It will instead drive them to other places. And so I think that one of the, you know, it is important, I think, for Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms to think about how they can better moderate content. But you know, these other types of discussions will go on elsewhere if they're not able to hold them on Twitter.
I will add to that. I would like to see some of the media companies creating more accountability for themselves and for other media channels in stopping hate, dangerous, or violent speech on their platforms. I think we saw Facebook attempt to do this by blocking or deleting some people's Facebook posts. I'm sure many of you saw some of your friends say things like, oh, my Facebook post was deleted by Facebook. And so I think they attempted to do some of those things in a really not proficient way, that some of the things that they were deleting, removing, or blocking probably actually shouldn't have been. But I would like to see a little bit more accountability. And of course, President Trump is the most notable person to be banned. And I'm not calling for, you know, widespread banning of people, but I do think there should be a precedent for those types of actions to be removed. We don't allow people to show up to our front door in our schools and act certain ways. You would not allow somebody to come to your front door and talk to you that way and invite them in. You would say, no, this is not okay, acceptable behavior, and sure. And maybe not banning people permanently, but I do think this set a precedent that possibly will help other media platforms say, we don't want to facilitate this on our platform where it can be widespread. And so I'm not necessarily always for restrictions and moderations or whatever you may want to call it, but I do hope that some of the media companies will take a look at their policies and how they're treating everyone fairly, not just President Trump, but how they're using those same policies and rules across the board for everyone. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it just happens to be that President Trump is the most notable in this time frame that this has happened to. So I think it'll be interesting to see if any of the media companies do kind of take a look at how can we prevent these actions from happening, or should we? I think that's a good question to ask as well.
I'd like to just add one more thing that is related to what Elizabeth has just said and some of the discourse that Kaitlin has brought into the Zoom chat as well. And that comes back to one of my areas, which is the ways that systems of inequality in real life get reproduced online and in online systems. And so I think that to Elizabeth's point, that it's whether or not we're calling for more or less moderation, more or less reaction to when people do not follow the terms of service or do not follow the community guidelines that they agreed to, that has not historically been done in any kind of equitable way. And that even though right now it's coming down on a very powerful man, and so we're all kind of paying attention to it, historically it has happened to the much more marginalized in our group that have not been protected when they've been getting death threats, getting rape threats, getting all kinds of horrible hate speech online, that has been allowed to go. So I think that a part of this question as we're going forward is that we take this example that now that we're all kind of fired up with this, right, and we see what these platforms can do, and we require that they start equitably distributing this kind of power. Because, and just to give like one quick receipt, because we are academics here after all, I don't think anybody needs to look any further than say Gamergate and the response to Gamergate for an example of all of the ways that death threats were ignored. People had to go into witness protection and like major actors who primarily were women in the gaming industry. So I just think we also need to name that this is a persistent problem. And now it's happened to the powerful, and maybe now we can take the history of it and, you know, insist that our platforms work for us in better ways and in more equitable ways.
Great, thank you. We have to slowly come to an end of our discussion, but I'm not quite done. I have two very good questions still in waiting, so I want to ask these and focus on those. And one of them is a question for Professor Cobb, and I just lost it. I can't find it anymore. But oh, here it is. So, and I think I want to just preface this. Last week when I moderated this discussion, there were a lot of questions that asked why were there not more arrests, right? When we talked the day after the you know, the attack on the Capitol, there were very few arrests made in the immediate aftermath, and there were a lot. We got multiple people asking that, and I mean, by now we know there have been many more arrests have been made, and social media and all the, you know, people posting themselves on social media was, you know, the major tool for this, right? And so the question for Dr. Cobb is, do you foresee the attack in the Capitol changing the way the intelligence community uses social media to collect intelligence from now on? Is this event a paradigm shift of sorts?
There, I unmuted myself. My take on this is that the events that took place at the Capitol really highlight the importance of open source intelligence. And one of the issues with social media that's very relevant to people who are doing open source intelligence analysis is that there is a massive amount of content, lots and lots of things that are being said by lots and lots of people. And it's very difficult to differentiate between what they call signals and noise, like indicators that some violence actually will happen, and then all of this other chatter that really doesn't actually mean very much. And the intelligence community, therefore, faces a situation that's not unlike what the social media companies themselves are facing, is that you now have a ton of content that you have to not moderate, but rather analyze. And that's going to take a lot of manpower. The, you know, obvious solution is perhaps improvements in artificial intelligence programs to better analyze things and to determine which types of speech or types of things being discussed might actually indicate real threats and which might be less important, more, you know, idle chatter. But one of the things that also could really affect how the intelligence community, or, you know, more likely the law enforcement community, since we're talking about a domestic security issue, addresses this, is what we see next. So if this is something that's limited to riots, maybe it's less of a big deal. If we see an escalation in violence, so for example, if we see greater activity by armed militias, or if there's some kind of growing domestic terror threat, that's something that would also, you know, it's a possibility that would take things in a different direction and put a totally different spin on the kind of intelligence analysis that law enforcement agencies would have to do. And I think a lot of that is still to be determined. But for the time being, I think it's very clear that social media companies and governments alike, they need better and more efficient ways to sort through information that is put on social media to determine what things are truly threats and where they're coming from, and what things are lower priority. Obviously, in a democratic society, you can't arrest everyone who says something hateful online, nor would you want to try. But there's a lot of work to do, and I think a lot of it will be done by people with computer science degrees, if I had to guess.
Great, thank you. So maybe we do a little closing remarks, just some of the questions we have left that we didn't answer yet. I want to just first say, we did that last week. We will go into the Facebook chat, and I will ask our panelists to take a look and go through the questions and type in a few answers. That would be really lovely. But maybe a little bit of look ahead. So we're getting a lot of these questions here. You know, what do we do? How do we engage our colleagues, our faculty, faculty members, our family members and colleagues and all this moving forward, right? What do we learn from all of this?
Well, I guess I'll start. I think that one of the things is that people, what they say can have an effect. You know, what you say online can have an effect on things that happen in real life. And I think we should, you know, all of us hopefully should be cautious, therefore, about what kinds of messages that we're putting out to the rest of the world and what sources of information we take in. And I think that's something that we can do on a personal level. But if we look at a larger level, a societal level, there are a lot of unanswered questions about how you can monitor or perhaps police things like hate speech or violent rhetoric without violating different civil liberties or privacy issues. And this is something that is an issue, not just in the United States, but in quite a few countries. But it is clear that having these types of events, it's very significant violence, something that you obviously, for a lot of reasons, don't want to see repeated. And unfortunately, I think that like many forms of political violence, this is something that's going to require a very long cooling off period. A lot of times to, you know, improve security, sort of time, there's a big element to time in that too, letting things chill out and letting society heal a bit. So these are things that we all have to consider moving forward.
Great. I don't know if anyone else. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just offer, I mean, the advice is what it is. I don't know all the answers going forward. But I think, so I think I tend to lean on the side of, you know, meeting people with the assumption that that education will help. Obviously, here we are. But and there's, I think, people have varying degrees of how helpful that is. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the constant calls for critical media literacy are now kind of being critiqued as like, is that all we can offer? Isn't there more? And you know, I think yes and no to that. It's not all that there is. I think it's an important thing. And so I think in terms of like, how do you engage with friends, family members, colleagues, community members, and so on. I will also just grain of salt that this is, you know, easier said than done in some cases, I know, but I think that we do have the power to help with that, right? That when a meme comes across our text messages or a group chat or whatever, that is clearly photoshopped, right? Or a tweet that is clearly photoshopped, right? It is like missing key features of the Twitter interface or something that is obviously fake. I think it is worth at this point calling that in, right? And actually naming like, okay, but this isn't real. Can we find another source for this? And trying to heighten that persistence of literacy as you go forward, right? That it's about asking, okay, can I find a source for this? When you read something
just on your own feeds, and it's like inflammatory or even non-inflammatory but upsetting, right? Like even if it's just a mild level of being upset, which at this point might have been inflammatory in 2019, who knows? But just something that like gives you pause, right? And is like, what? This can't be right. That it is worth that next step of like trying to determine if it is right. And I also think that the last thing that, as far as advice goes, is finding the media bias, putting some time into media bias research now to just act as some kind of guide. Because I think it's really easy to say like, you need to double check your sources and you need to find follow-up and you need to do this and that and the other. But like we're drowning in information, right? Having more information is not the answer. That's just going to create noise. So I think part of it is helping create for yourself a way for you to determine those signals, to refer back to Matt's metaphor earlier, right? Of like, is this a newspaper source that generally speaking, I can trust? Whether or not I agree with it, generally speaking, we agree that we can trust it. Is this a meme or is it an actual news article? Is this an opinion piece or is it, a news article? Just to keep going back to news articles. But, and I think just heightening that persistence and training yourself to maintain those questions, even just as quick little blips, and then following through and just creating that habit, I think is a good step.
I think just to add to all the great comments, but just to go back to a sort of a starting point here. I think part of this is just also about empathy and I think getting to the empathy requires conversation and engagement. And I think that it's reminding ourselves that we're all human and that there's a lot of common ground, whether you're on the right or the left, there is a lot of common ground. And I think that's something that we need to remind ourselves, that we get lost in the noise and in the static of all these different kinds of messages and framing of things and being on different sides. But I think at the end of the day, I think we're talking about the struggle for human dignity. And I think that one of the things about the history of social movements is how hard it is to organize, how hard it is to get people to understand about their value as human beings, because that's at the heart of the feminist movement, the heart of the fight for civil rights, the fight for labor unions, was to get people from outside of the box of being alienated and reconnecting to themselves about the significance and meaning about being human. And I think that's something that that might seem a little bit hokey or a little perhaps too idealistic, but I think at the end of the day, you think about the activists who put their bodies on the line, Muhammad Gandhi, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King. The history of nonviolence was a story about demonstrating, this meaning and significance of being human and how to treat people with dignity. So I think that's something we should remind ourselves about, that it's about conversation and engagement, and understanding there's a lot more things in common than there are things that divide us.
My last comment would be, along those lines as well. Really consider who you're following on your social media pages. Social media was meant to connect us, to make us social with our closest circles. And don't be afraid to defriend or unfollow or unlike people that add no value to your life. And I'm not saying defriend, unfollow people that you don't agree with, but seriously consider, did you friend like this person just because you want a lot of friends or likes or followers or whatever it is? Or are you genuinely gaining something from that person following you, liking you, whatever it is? Because I feel like, it's so easy just to let everyone be our friend or follow us. But do we really know who that is? Do you know who that person is that's sharing the information that could be fake or false? If you have public profiles, who is interacting with the things that you post? And are they people that you would want to have interacting with you in the real world? And so I think, it caught up in the social media influencing and being an influencer, sometimes we forget that social media was really intended to interact with people that are close to you, or that you want to stay connected with. And it's connected us to so many other things and so many other people around the world, which has been great as well. But I know for me personally, I've been taking a look at some of the people that I follow on social media or that follow me and asking myself, do I really know this person? Are they adding value to my life? Whether it be something I agree with or something I don't agree with. And is it necessary for them to be in my social circles? Because you don't know, you don't know who it is. And if they're using track you or for business or commerce or what. So just my call to action would be to think about your social media usage and who's following you and how you would do that in real life. And I think that can really help your social media usage as well and your mental health.
I think the thing that I would end on for this is, you know, we keep on saying, you know, reality and online. It's like there are people on the other end of a computer screen, unless they're trolls, right? But in general, they're people, right? And I think the really scary thing about social media and the internet is that it desensitizes us, you know, so that to the point that you can go onto the Capitol and start as a protest and then end up throwing a fire extinguisher at a police officer's head. I mean, probably something like, I'm sure if you said to the people who did those acts 10 years ago, you're going to do this, they would not, it would be very unexpected, right? They would say, no, I wouldn't, I'd never do that. And so I think that's that would be me, right? But I just remember that there are people on the other end of this. And, you know, when a police officer has to yell at protesters, you know, to please stop hurting him because he has a family and he has children. And then that's the one thing that gets you to kind of go, oh, wait, you are a human being. That's a little scary, right? It's a little scary that you have to actually say that people just can't see you for who you are, which is a human being, no matter what you may or may not believe in. So I think that would be my kind of pitch, is just to remember that, you know, no matter if you have an R or a D, or if you're really conservative, or if you're really liberal, or if you're somewhere in the middle, or if you don't care about politics at all, that you just try and remember that, you know, these are your neighbors. These are people who you walk past in a grocery store. These are people that you drive on the roads with. You know, these are just normal everyday people. And I would hope that we could remember, you know, to be just respectful at the very least to each other, so that we don't see this kind of behavior in the future.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think those were very, very powerful words here at the end in particular, and we want to very much keep that in mind. Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. You know, Memorial Day, so let's all be aware of that. And I want to just quickly say several of the themes and topics we addressed today, we already have decided to pick up in the next rounds of panels. So just brainstorming a little, we most certainly want to have a panel on the whole aspect of diversity, equity, inclusion, race, ethnicity, white supremacy, gender, all of these aspects we have discussed already. So that I think is very important. Media literacy is clearly something we're not done discussing quite yet. So we will bring that back, the question of the press, journalism, right? Fake news, media literacy, all of that. And then reacting to adversity through the arts. We are the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. There's a lot to be said in that area as well. And then the global perspective, really just the, you know, let's see how that came up today as well, but how does the world respond and react to all of this? And what do these events mean for the US, the standing of the US in the world, actually, for foreign policy, all of these aspects. So I think that's all very important, and many more topics. And that's what I want to say to the people who are still on Facebook and people who are watching it. If you have ideas, suggestions, let us know. We have a never-ending, you know, depository and supply of fabulous faculty here. So I'm really delighted. I think we had now 2 weeks of, you know, of wonderful panelists, and I think this is great, and we want to keep doing this. It's Friday, 5:15, and here we are. So good work, everybody. Thank you so much. I think it was a great discussion. I continue to believe having people coming from the different areas of expertise is really enriching for this and very important. And I hope the next few days will be peaceful. I hope the inauguration will be a peaceful event, and have a good weekend, everyone, and I'll see you soon.